Okay, so Wesley Wark, thank you for taking the time to talk to me and the students at the University of Waterloo today. We're going to be talking about the role of information technology in modern warfare and in national security. But before we do, you have a distinguished background. You're at the University of Toronto. You're spending some time at the University of Ottawa, I believe now. But you've also advised government and other people about intelligence and technology, particularly. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I want to mislead anybody, you or your students. So I don't regard myself as a technology expert, but certainly I think reasonably familiar with the policy challenges around national security and intelligence issues, and technology, of course, impacts on all that, as well as being obviously one of the main drivers of change.
Indeed, especially today. And I want to ask first about modern warfare and the way that that is changing as a result of information technology. In the course that I teach, we talk about fourth generation warfare, we talk about net-centric warfare. And so I'm keen to get a sense of how you see the developments that we're seeing there around technology and warfare.
Right. I mean, from my perspective, I think technological change in the area of armed forces and rapidly. I think it also has to be put to a degree in perspective in a couple of ways. That a lot of what we talk about when we talk about cyber warfare is a kind of projection into the future of what we might anticipate might happen. I mean, there are some examples of what some people call hybrid warfare, the use of cyber tools in conflicts. But I guess the first thing to say is we've never experienced, and perhaps never will experience, an all-out kind of cyber war or conflict scenario in which cyber is used as a main tool of aggression. And so it's important, I think, in the context of talking about cyber warfare and new technological tools for the military to still, I think, contextualize that in a broader framework of the root causes of conflict and the conduct of warfare itself. And I suppose the main point I would make, or main couple of points on that I would make, which I hope doesn't kind of contradict what, in a confusing way, what your students may have heard already, is first of all that from my perspective, the addition of cyber tools to warfare, expands the arena of potential conflict and the tools available to the military. I find it very difficult, to be honest, to imagine anything like a standalone cyber war in which cyber tools would be either the tools that would be used in any deliberate fashion to launch an aggression, or a war in which cyber tools would, at this stage in technological development, who knows in future centuries, but certainly at this stage would be the main tool of aggression. In other words, they fit into a spectrum of tools available to the military, but only likely to be used, it seems to me, this is the kind of caveat and the caution about talking about cyber warfare, they're only likely to be used in a go to war, and has also made the calculation, just as important, that the use of cyber tools is on balance likely to be beneficial to that party in a conflict. And to step away from that, I suppose I would also say that there has been some thinking that would suggest that very powerful cyber tools have some similarities, not in terms of destructive capability necessarily, but in terms of strategic use. They have some similarities to nuclear weapons. In other words, the more powerful they become, it may well be, or this may be just slightly overly optimistic and reassuring, self-reassuring, but it's also possible that the more powerful they become, the less likely they will be used, at least in any deliberative sense. So that if you imagine a set of, let's say, nation-state aggressors with very powerful cyber tools, I think there is a real likelihood that the parties to any conflict would be self-deterred from using them because of the potential destructive power and, in a way, the incalculability of the impacts of cyber warfare. So I suppose it is to say, from my perspective, the best way to think about cyber tools, their application, cyber technology and their application to warfare is at this stage to say it is a new tool. It's a tool that fits into a kind of conventional understanding of warfare, how it's conducted, and what brings it about. And that the wilder, as I would call them, speculations about standalone cyber warfare are really, at this stage at least, pure science fiction.
And with that, there seem to be some people who are concerned about a massive destructive potential, reservoirs, industrial facilities, nuclear power stations being impacted by cyber warfare, and others who feel that the risks that are there are perhaps less. So there's a range of opinion there. Do you have a sense of, you describe a big destructive potential, I think, in what you've just said, but where would you sit on that spectrum?
Yeah, so I'm not sure, to be honest, where I sit exactly on that spectrum, but I would say a couple of things. One is that, when you think about the ways in which cyber tools, if not right now, but at some point in the near future, might be used against certain kinds of targets, and we're often talking about basically civilian critical infrastructure, transportation systems, hospitals, power systems, power generation systems, and so on. The question, there are two questions that have to be asked. The first and most important question is, what is the strategic scenario in which an aggressor would use that kind of tool in that sort of way? And my answer to that would be, again, I don't think it's all that rational to think about using those cyber tools as standalone weapons. Not least because you get into, any use of that kind, if deliberate or semi-deliberate, gets into an escalatory spiral of a kind that we're very familiar with from nuclear war fighting doctrine and deterrence during the Cold War. The second thing to keep in mind in terms of the use of cyber weapons to target, let's say, civilian critical infrastructure or governance systems as opposed to pure military targets, if we can still identify those in a kind of Geneva Convention sort of way. The second consideration is an issue of how vulnerable exactly are these different systems to off-site cyber attacks. And, some of the scarier kinds of targets that people have been talking about, like, nuclear power stations and so on, generally the command and control systems for nuclear power stations, as is well known, are basically offline. I mean, they're not, you can't intrude on them from a distance using cyber tools. You may find other ways to intrude on them, but that would require really some form of human intervention in terms of, an agent being on the scene willing to engage in some kind of plot. So, when people fear those kinds of attacks, generally what we often don't see being explored in those fears is a more precise calculation about vulnerability. And I'm sure there's a range of vulnerabilities depending on the target that we might be talking about, but that all has to be taken into account. More importantly, I think there is a big question to be asked about, strategic rationale. So, what aggressor would launch that kind of attack with what kinds of anticipated outcomes and what kind of calculus of potential benefit and risk? And, in that kind of, again, thinking about cyber war in that sense, I just find it, I suppose this places me somewhere on the don't worry spectrum as opposed to the Dr. Strangelove end of the spectrum. My sense is, well, if we, whoever we is, find ourselves in an all-out war with some nation state aggressor, sure, we can anticipate that in some scenarios in that kind of all-out war, and we'd have to be careful about what those scenarios are, but the framework is all-out war, sure, there will be cyber tools potentially used. Will cyber warfare dictate the forms of conflict in the future? Will it be used as a standalone tool? I don't think so.
Okay. And as far as Canada goes, do you have a sense of how well we're adapting to be able to have cyber warfare capability in our military?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly. I mean, our defense strategy that was announced, I think last year, as I recall, Strong, Secure, and Engage, I think was the acronym for it, does have an interesting kind of component to it, talking about the build up of a cyber warfare capability. I think, and you know, so that is a work in progress. It is a reflection of a recognition that the Canadian military has to have these kinds of tools if it's going to engage in conflict or even some forms of peacekeeping operations or stabilization missions of the sort that we're conducting on NATO's behalf in Eastern Europe and the Baltics at the moment. So, you know, it is a tool I think that all Western militaries realize they have to have some capacity for. I think it's probably fair to say that the Canadian government and the Canadian military had no desire to be a kind of pioneer or leader in this regard. We wanted to have the capability. We're probably playing catch up a little bit, but I think there was a kind of prudential calculus that this capacity had to be developed slowly and carefully. And, you know, not only did you have to be able to develop the talent in terms of personnel, you had to decide, you know, what tools exactly you might need. You also needed very clear command and control authorities around the use of cyber weapons in, you know, kind of a legal sense and in terms of lawful authority sense. And so there are lots of different moving pieces to it. It's not just the technology piece, it's also the kind of human talent piece, the organizational piece, and again, probably most importantly, the command and control piece. So all of these things I think are moving in terms of our own Department of National Defense at different velocity. That's hard to measure whether they're all moving at the same pace. But I think a lot of thought certainly has been put into at least two parts of that capability. One is, what does lawful authority look like in terms of the deployment of cyber weapons, and therefore, what does a command and control system need to look like? And secondly, at a kind of different remove, how does the military attract cyber warfare operators? This is a different kind of skill set from somebody who might drive a tank or you know, a rifleman with a, you know, whatever the latest automatic weapon might be. So it's forcing the Canadian military to think about the need to recruit talent differently than they have typically done in the past, because, you know, they realize, as do many other sectors of society concerned about various forms of cyber, that you can't bring in somebody and train them up from scratch to, you know, be fully aware and capable in this world. You have to be able to draw in talent that at least has a good deal of preliminary training in that regard. So they have to think about different recruitment models and different ways of retaining people who have the skills that they're looking to build.
Yeah, interesting. I'm looking at digital transformation in Canadian manufacturing at the moment, and they're facing some of the same questions, you know, about how to recruit, the types of skills, the types of changes that's going to mean for them as organizations. And I guess the military have the same questions.
Yes, absolutely. Probably, you know, compounded by the fact the military is a certain kind of organization. It has certain kinds of training regimes that it has to put everybody through. A cyber warrior, cyber operator is going to also have to be put through basic military training. How many people with those kinds of skills really want to do that? So profound kind of cultural change the military is going to have that capability.
Very interesting. So some people have said that we may need a Geneva Convention for cyber war. Have you got any thoughts about whether that's appropriate and what it might have if it is?
Yes, I mean, it's getting increasingly difficult, it seems, in our lifetime, Peter and mine at least, to come up with new forms of international accords, and particularly in the world of the cyber domain. My sense around this is that the expectation at the moment that seems to govern thinking on this is that the Geneva Conventions are, a pretty strong, they can always be broken and always abused, but they're pretty strong and well-established set of conventions that are respected by many militaries from many different kinds of regimes around the world, and that they can be adapted to the realm of cyber warfare. So adaptation is, I think, what people are hoping for, rather than some new rewriting of the Geneva Convention so that you would have a Geneva Cyber Convention. There are obviously efforts underway in terms of international discussions and bilateral discussions among key players in the nation state universe to talk about restraints on the use of various forms of cyber aggression, as I call it. And a lot of this focuses in part on cyber espionage. Can we draw this down a little bit? A lot of it focuses on intellectual property theft. Can we contain this? But there are offshoots of that conversation which also reflect on trying to establish limits on the reasonable, lawful use of cyber weapons in a war setting. And on that front, I think people hope that the Geneva Convention can be used as a framework, rather than that it's likely. I think the feeling is it's very unlikely that a new cyber warfare convention will be adopted. So I think they're putting their faith in 19th and early 20th century thinking in that regard to cope with the 21st century and beyond.
Yeah, one of the areas that you see this discussed in is with automatic weapons that find and decide to act on their own targets.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and there's been some fascinating writing about this, as I'm sure you and your students are aware. People like Peter Singer and others have been discussing this. I think that current generation of military leaders certainly believe that it is important to retain human control over decision making on the deployment of weapons and their operation. I don't think there's a movement from the military profession in favor of kind of the automatic or autonomous use of robotics and artificial intelligence to inform the use of violence on a battlefield or battle space. Whether are there circumstances in which that belief that you have to have human agency at critical points of decision making, the use of violence, is that likely to be eroded? I don't see any signs of that at the moment. It obviously could be eroded in the midst of a war itself, particularly on the part of a belligerent who may, face disastrous defeat without some recourse. But, those are pretty extreme circumstances. So I think the conventional thinking at the moment, which I hope will sort of hold, is that as military systems are increasingly made more effective by application of artificial intelligence, robotics, data management, and so on, that nevertheless there will always remain an appreciation that they can never be fully autonomous systems. There has to be a legitimate human command and control interface. And that's where we seem to be at the moment. I think that's where people hope we'll go.
Okay. Do you think that we're in the midst of the development of a new technology-based Cold War? We thought the Cold War was done in '89. Do you think a new one is developing now, especially between maybe the US and China and maybe other countries too?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about that. It's a very interesting kind of phenomenon. One of our colleagues at the University of British Columbia, Paul Evans, has coined a phrase which I think is quite fascinating. The phrase he's coined is techno-nationalism. so that you're getting a combination of kind of nationalistic impulses behind policy making and a desire to be a technological leader. And when you weld those two together, and that can be the case of China or Russia or the United States or other powers in the global system, you get a quite dangerous phenomenon. I think there is certainly elements of a technological Cold War present in American thinking about the current global arena, and that's really driven by fears of Chinese intentions, fears of the growth of Chinese economic power, in particular by aspects of declared Chinese economic grand strategy, if you like, around key sectors of investment for China, areas like artificial intelligence, robotics, 5G technology, hence all the attention on Huawei, for example. So that the United States, in terms of responding to this, is finding itself, and people have used the analogy in a bit of a sort of Sputnik moment to think back to the Cold War, where it appears that a major international rival, sometimes competitor, sometimes adversary, often described as both an American official national security doctrine, looks set to steal a lead, and the United States feels it has to respond, the United States in particular. And in responding is kind of is acting in a reactive fashion, but also looking to draw allies and partners into its camp in terms of a unified response. And I think that is, from an American perspective, they see them. I think it's fair to say they see themselves as kind of taking a global lead in combating certain forms of Chinese expansionism. Including, if you like, technological imperialism, as the Americans would see it, and in that context, have reached back themselves to a kind of Cold War analogy, arguing to allies like Canada that we have a responsibility to join the American camp and support an American based initiative to fight back against Chinese strategic aims. And I think many people have great reservations about that way of thinking about the world, but I think it's a powerful current in the Trump administration at the moment in the United States.
Oh, you're cutting out there. You've cut out there for a second, Wesley.
Okay. Sorry about that. I didn't see anything at my end.
We lost about the last 30 seconds or so.
So I think where we might have been at was, I was just suggesting that if you ask yourself the question, whatever the kind of current strains and whatever the sort of framework that the United States is trying to put in place at the moment around what might look like a technological Cold War, I think you ask yourself the question of is in the long term a technological Cold War strategically viable? I think most people would say not really. You have to find a different way of coping with change in the global system, of coping with rivalry, and that change has to take account of something that wasn't really a phenomenon for most of the Cold War, which is the reality of globalization. So, technological development is never going to be, fully in the control of or containable by great powers, superpowers in a global system. It's in the global commons, and it's going to be, an uncontrollable phenomenon, and states in the system are going to have to live with that, it seems to me, and they're going to have to do their best to retain technological capabilities, but to imagine you can do that in a divided world, in a world of sanctions and trade tariffs and high-flown rhetoric, just seems to me to be a very unproductive idea and very strategically unwise.
Okay, so what you've talked about there certainly relates to the Huawei case, but
Yeah.
you suggest that really that's not being dealt with very well.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think that the American campaign against Huawei, and I think it's absolutely fair to call it a campaign or crusade, has has not been very cleverly thought through or initiated, and it's currently experienced the kind of backlash that I anticipated would happen sooner or later. A backlash being, revolving around a couple of issues. One is, in a world of technological development, what do you accomplish by trying to banish one high technology company from the scene? I mean, does that really increase your security? And the answer to that, I think, has to be no, not really at all. And the other is, what are the costs of trying to control a marketplace of technological change in terms of impacts on your own economy and development and prosperity? So, I think the problem with the debate about Huawei is that a little bit too much of it has been a debate about scenarios of security risks that haven't been very well nailed down, and I think are mostly illusory. And what's been missing in the debate is a sense of what the global marketplace for 5G technological change actually looks like. And one of the reasons why I think people are so skeptical about the American campaign against Huawei is rooted in the fact that the United States and the U.S. economy has no player in 5G development. People talk a little bit about Cisco, but it's not up there among the big 5G developers, innovators, who are basically Huawei, a Chinese company, but not a state-owned enterprise. And that's a distinction I think that matters. Some people say it doesn't. But Huawei and Ericsson and Nokia, there are no American players there at all, which is really, when you think about, technological change in the course of the 20th century, that's a pretty phenomenal statement, but it's a reality.
Absolutely. Part of the concerns, I guess, what you've been talking about here leads into my next point, which is cyber attacks on democracy. And, we've certainly seen evidence that those have occurred, and concerns continue to exist around them. What are your thoughts around that? How should we be responding to them? I guess, how serious do you think they are?
Yeah, they're undoubtedly serious. I think the landscape, though, I would suggest is changing with regard to cyber threats to democracy, cyber threats around foreign interference in elections, for example, which is often one sort of focus for these concerns. And when I say the landscape is changing, what I mean is that the initial attention to these problems was really focused on state actors and nefarious state actor behavior, the Russians, others, but primarily the Russians, in the context of what we've learned about election interference in the United States and other places. The changing landscape is a product, I think, of a couple of things. One is that what I would call defensive capabilities or cybersecurity capabilities are at a place where they have the capability to deal with, blunt many of these state-sponsored attacks. And the more that capability develops, I think the more likely you will see a kind of informal doctrine of deterrence for state actors. In other words, state actors tempted to use cyber weapons to intrude in a democratic space, in a social space in a foreign country, are going to have to think twice about the extent to which they can get away with it or can benefit from it, or what the costs of being exposed publicly to some kind of shaming campaign, be exposed to criminal charges, be exposed to counterattacks might be. So there's a rising security capability around state-sponsored attacks, a rising, I think, deterrent phenomenon around state-sponsored attacks, which partly shifts the landscape. The other part of it is that I think what is what is increasingly capturing people's attention is interference in a democratic space in terms of dialogue, elections, interaction of citizens, citizen behavior, coming not from state actors, but from non-state actors, whether they're, individuals with some kind of cause to espouse, troll networks, fake news operatives, people who can't distinguish between fake news and real news. The information space in which we live our lives, and the data space in which we live our lives, is getting really complex. And I think the danger is there, as opposed to not being able to deal with the big state-sponsored campaigns. I think we're finding ways to deal with those state-sponsored campaigns and limit their damage. I think the real frontier of both danger and policy and capability response is around interference coming from non-state actors. And that can include individuals. It can include criminal organizations. Obviously, it can include corporations bent on achieving some kind of objective for their own purposes. So there are many possible actors out there, and it's an area where creating some kind of societal hygiene is going to be very, very difficult. Both in terms of citizen responsibility, but also in terms of governmental responsibility. And I think we're on the edge of a very interesting debate about the role of the state in regulating. I mean, this sounds very Orwellian, but in regulating discourse, particularly with regard to the internet. And obviously, democratic states are not thinking in Orwellian terms, but they are having to think hard about to what extent can the state effectively intrude by setting standards and laws and requirements around digital behavior. And we're in Canada on the edge of that. The Minister of Public Safety has hinted that there is legislation coming, which would be first wave legislation really to set in place some standards around digital behavior and digital discourse. Other states are grappling with this. The European Union has put in a new set of data regulations that is designed, but it's primarily designed as a privacy tool, so not directly usable in this context. But I think this is a hugely important kind of frontier of thinking and of danger. How do we ensure that there remains a safe, free, open space, a global commons, as people often talk about it, for digital living and digital discourse, I think that is going to be one of the great democratic challenges of the 21st century. How to figure out the role of the state in that regard, what can the state do, and what can individual citizens do themselves.
Yeah, I think a really interesting illustration of this over the last couple of weeks has been an increasing debate around vaccinations, where, previously the government would have spread a message that most people would believe that vaccinations were important, and they had a good health responsibility to do this. It was very desirable that they encouraged people to get vaccinations. Now their ability to spread that message seems to be, and not to have it challenged, but seems to be more difficult. And it's resulting in people dying. Measles is back in some areas, and people are dying because of it.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. It's partly a challenge around, the extent of governmental power and legitimacy of government authority as it's perceived. And I think the Canadian government, other governments in the democratic world recognize these problems. The challenges around expertise, challenges around authority, challenges around trust, and the solution to that they're really thinking about is in a way, trying to download this responsibility on major private sector providers in the social media space. When I say download, I mean creating some set of regulations and laws that would govern the behavior of these private sector companies, but putting a lot of onus on the private sector social media providers, the Googles, Microsofts, and others of the world, Apple and so on, to come up with a system that tries to sustain a safe space for, again, digital living, digital discourse. We'll see how that goes, because most of the major global social media providers are used to operating in a pretty rules-free environment. And they talk a good game about protecting privacy and trying to deal with hate crimes and so on, and incitements. But even in that regard, and that's kind of relatively limited arena for operation, even in that regard, people are skeptical, and the track record is not great. So I think governments think the only way to do this is not by imposing a government-directed way of dealing with this problem, but it's really imposing on the private sector rules and norms around how the private sector comports itself, and make the private sector responsible. So it is, it's a new kind of world of free market control, capitalist self-surveillance, which is going to be unprecedented, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And with that mention of surveillance, that moves nicely into technology and the intelligence community. So what is the impact there? How is it affecting their work? And maybe beyond that, what does this mean for citizens and concerns around civil liberties, perhaps?
Yes, yeah, those are all excellent questions, and there are no easy answers to them, and it's even, I think, hard to be all that confident about identifying trends. But I suppose I would begin by saying that for intelligence systems and intelligence communities, as they're often referred to, there was a moment in time not so long ago when the basic idea that was circulating in those systems was that technology was going to shut down their enterprise, as remarkable as that might seem. And this was particularly around the rise of encryption systems in particular, in a sense that this would just put intelligence communities that rely on an ability to engage in various forms of intrusive surveillance, it would put them out of business. So that it's often referred to as spy agencies going dark, going blind, and so on. That was a fear in the 90s. I think it's been hugely balanced by a different sense of the opportunities, if you like, the tech opening up of pools of information accessible to them, and a revolution within intelligence systems of what's called open source intelligence, which is basically all that information you can get, short of having to use spy techniques, whether human or surveillance-based systems. So all of that publicly available data, or grayly available data, it becomes a huge boon for intelligence systems. And much of that, of course, is generated by revolutions in the internet and communications. So the thinking has shifted from technology is going to make us go dark, is going to create blindness. It's shifted to a world in which technology has created so much potential access to information that it is overwhelming. And the analogy that is often used is spy agencies often talk about drinking from fire hydrants. So you put your mouth on a fire hydrant, bad things are going to happen. But here is where I think technology comes in from a different angle, and particularly things like new ways of data management, data storage, use of supercomputers, use of algorithms, use of artificial intelligence capabilities. All of that package of technology is being deployed or thought about being deployed in the context of now dealing with the phenomenon, not that used to be the problem of spy agencies, lots of secrets out there that were hard to get. The new phenomenon is lots of information that's hard to manage. And so, technology is being used to manage all of that, purely available information. To get to the point about, this might seem in a way a kind of benign development, so that, spy agencies are spying on open source information. Fantastic. This is a huge change. But the problem is in that regard, and this is where civil liberties and privacy concerns come in, it's really around how we understand public-private categories of information, how we kind of reconfigure our understanding of privacy, and what spheres are we comfortable, even in a public space, allowing intelligence agencies and their new technological capabilities to intrude on. And this has been a debate in Canada, particularly around new legislation, which is still moving at snail's pace through Parliament. Bill C-59, the national security legislation that the Liberals brought in 2017, summer of 2017, which will give new powers to our Signals Intelligence Agency, CSE, to hunt in the world of publicly available data. It will give new powers to CASIS to compile bulk data sets of certain kinds of information. So the intelligence services believe that they need to move into those areas to maintain their capabilities, to fulfill their mandate to provide or contribute to public safety. But there's a lot of concern about what the meaning of this might all be in terms of applying technology to that huge new wealth of information available, if it can be managed by the intelligence services. And the Canadian government, and I think fair to say many other governments around the world, the response to that is to say, that world of, vastly expanded information is there. We have to have access to it. Intelligence services have to have access to it. We'll do our best to control that access through laws and mandates and lawful authority. But we have one other protection that we want to apply to this, which is to have a much more robust, better system of review, so that if we see abuses that we might not have been able to predict, or interpretations of lawful mandates which we don't like because they don't seem to be normative, then the review system can kind of rush in and say, this is not good, we have to do things differently. So you're getting an idea of societal control through review, trying to intrude in this space as a referee, as intelligence services go after these new technological capabilities. So it's a kind of many ring circus, and who knows where it will go.
Yeah, well, what you're suggesting is that the capabilities that are emerging are perhaps much stronger than existed in the past, and we're seeing those being applied in countries like China, Russia, where these are being used more for citizen control. And you're saying, well, yes, the security services need access to those things, but because of that, because they are so powerful, we need a better system of control.
Yeah, absolutely, and obviously, depending on the kind of regime, authoritarian, non-authoritarian, authoritarian, democratic, the circumstances of those regimes, the history of those countries, the degree to which, states like Russia and China embrace an idea of kind of democratic control of intelligence is minimal to non-existent.
Yeah.
But it is an idea that at least is held on to by the West. And then the challenge in the interface between those kinds of authoritarian states wanting to use surveillance systems in certain kinds of ways, and Western approaches. The challenge is to, create bulwarks to prevent the arrival of those kind of authoritarian practices on our own soil, whether intentionally or by some form of kind of mission creep for our own intelligence services.
Yep, makes sense. I just got two final questions. Thank you for your time so far. The first is around the war on terrorism and cyber capabilities.
Right.
I know this is something you've looked at, I believe, in the past. How do you see that developing?
Yeah, it's again, it's a bit like the discussion on cyber warfare. If you're not careful and precise about your use of the terminology, I think you can be led vastly astray. So people have made connections between terrorism and terrorist groups, particularly international terrorist groups, and cyber capabilities, and there's always been a fear as those connections were made, a fear that terrorist groups might turn into actors that would violently use cyber tools against foreign targets. As much as some global terrorist groups might have some of that capability, we really haven't seen it at all. What we have seen, and this is where I think you can legitimately talk about the interface between cyber technology and terrorist groups, we have seen, of course, terrorist groups, whether it's Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, becoming very sophisticated in their use of cyber and information technology to promote their cause. And when I say promote their cause, I mean to recruit, to incite followers around the world, to broadcast a message about their ideology, to try to create a picture of success, and to propagate in a very classical way, at least attempt to propagate in a very classical way, kind of psychology of fear. So, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, others have been very good at that. They've had some temporary successes in that regard, and to use, I think, cyber capabilities for those kinds of purposes. It may be curious that they haven't used cyber purposes as attack tools, and that may partly reflect a lack of an ability to kind of map foreign targets, which always has to be kept in mind. You have to have a pretty sophisticated mapping capability to really use cyber weapons at a distance, and which reflects capability at all in the way we would think of states as having such capabilities. It may also reflect the fact that they don't really have the technological skill, or haven't really tried to develop the technological skill to do that. It's not to say they might not do it in the future, but the other reservation about the likelihood of terrorist groups becoming cyber warriors is that it simply may not fit the kind of modus operandi of terrorism. It may not resonate in terms of targets, resonate in terms of messaging, resonate in terms of kind of ideological support in the ways that the use of other kinds of weapons, and attack tactics that we've seen to produce, violence and fear have. Perhaps the way to reflect on this is that terrorist groups seem to be paradoxically very enamored of classical terrorist techniques. And there have been some innovations, of course, and the 9/11 attacks were innovative in their own way. But they're, on the whole, they're driven by, I think, a kind of legacy idea of how to think strategically and tactically, how to enact acts of violence. And I hope they stay in that space for a long time.
Absolutely. So my last question, we've talked through a lot of areas that might have caused people to become alarmed or fearful of the future. So I thought my last question would be a fairly simple one, though maybe quite big. Is the world getting safer or less safe as a result of cyber capabilities?
Yes. So I'm going to cop out here. But I have a suggestion about a way of thinking of this, as a kind of second best. The reality is that it's very hard to measure in the middle of a sort of fast-paced change whether we're getting safer or things are getting more dangerous. But I think the thing to really look out for here is the question of the relative balance between offensive capabilities and defensive systems. And as long as the world can find a reasonable balance that offense doesn't run way ahead of defensive capabilities, then we will find a way to control and constrain cyber threats. If we ever get to a space, and I don't think we have yet, where offensive capabilities are so freely available, so easily used, so damaging, and the defense is nowhere on the scene, then we really are in a dangerous space. But I don't see that as likely. The challenge is going to be to spread the defensive capability into all the areas of society. And we've talked about that a little bit, Peter, in terms of that broader social space and what governments are going to do to try and protect it. The starting point, in a way, it's a reassuring starting point, I think. The starting point is that many states have gotten very good at cybersecurity in a fairly narrow compass, which is cybersecurity around their own governmental critical infrastructure. In other words, governments have found ways to lock down systems that they own and control and feel important. And I think that is true for the government of Canada. It's not 100% defense, it's not foolproof, but on the whole, they have figured out a way to provide for cybersecurity in that narrow compass. Now the challenge is going to be expand that out into the societal space, and how do we do that when there are so many different players? It's not just the government saying we're going to lock down government controlled data systems and communication systems, and we're going to ring fence them with powerful security tools. We have done that. Many of our allies have done that quite successfully. Record isn't 100%, but how do you take that capability that has been developed as a kind of first stage capability, and how do you spread it out, into the global commons? That's going to be, and of course, many countries don't want to see that happen. The Chinese and Russians and North Koreans at the moment, and others, Iranians perhaps, don't want to see that happen. So I think that will be the big challenge, taking the capability that's being built and figuring out a way to make it a societal capability as opposed to a governmentally focused one.
Yeah, good thing. Thank you very much for your time, Wesley. I really appreciate you talking to people at Waterloo, and that's something that's going to be very valuable to them.
Well, great to chat. I must say I want to commend you for the kind of innovative format that you're using here. So well done. Very Waterloo-ish, I'm sure. So.